Responsiveness and the Stretching of Populism, Latin America in Comparative Perspective, organized by the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. I am Vicky Murillo. I'm the director of the Institute and the organizer of the conference. And I want to start by thanking Mónica Trigos and Esteban Andrade for helping make this possible. And as well as all of the ILA staff that helped in the organization of the conference. This conference was originally scheduled for spring of last year, and COVID forced us to reschedule, and we changed in a format that we think make it more tolerable for Zoom and remote presentation, which is going to be spread over 4 Fridays. So today we have the first session that I'm going to introduce in a second, but next Friday we have another session called The People from a Socio-Cultural Perspective with Federico Finkelstein, Claudio Lovnitz, Graciela Montaldo, Galia Solomonov, and Amy Chaskel as discussants. On February 12th, we do not meet, but we come back on February 19th to discuss the stretching of populism and its implications with Ken Roberts, Ernesto Calvo, and Amy Erica Smith, and Eduardo Moncada as a discussant. And finally, we finish on February the 26th with a webinar that has a roundtable on political responsiveness and populism in comparative perspective with Tim Fry, Sherry Berman, Robert Kaufman, and Justin Phillips, as well as 2 keynote speakers, Saskia Sassen and Jorge Castañeda. You're welcome to come to all parts of this event. We are streaming on Facebook Live, and Monica will be reading the comments to see if we can get questions there as well and sending them to me. And anybody who's in the kind of closed Zoom section, please use the raise your hand function in Zoom that by now we all know how to use it because we all teach. And I will be gathering questions. So the presentation will come. I'm going to present today's panel, the first panel, the erosion of political responsiveness in Latin America. First, before starting what is a fantastic panel, I have to, make the mea culpa that it's all of the panelists are male, and I don't know how this happened, but it did happen, and it was a mistake that it doesn't happen in the rest of the panels, but I want to acknowledge that this should have not happened. I'm the discussant, but that still doesn't count. So the panelists are going to be Cesar Zucco, who got his PhD at University of California, Los Angeles, and is an associate professor at the Fundación Getulio Vargas, IVAPE, in Rio de Janeiro. He was before an assistant professor at Rutgers and has held visiting appointments at Princeton, Yale, and Oxford. He's the author of The Volatility Course, Cambridge University Press 2020, a fantastic book, and Partisan and Antipartisan, and Partisans, Antipartisans, and Non-Partisans, Voting Behavior in Brazil, Cambridge University Press 2018, another book that I also teach in class. I recommend them both. Then we will have Francisco Junqueira, Chico, who got his PhD and LSE. He's an assistant professor at the Brazilian School of Economics and Finance, also in the Fundación Getulio Vargas, and he's also at the University of Delaware at Just Learn, and he works on the intersections of environmental economics, economic development, and applied microeconomics. Then we will have Patricio Navia, who received his PhD from NYU and is a professor of political science at the Universidad Diego Portales and a clinical professor of liberal studies at NYU. And he writes on democratic institutions, public opinion, elections, and legislative affairs in Chile. And we will finish with Juan Pablo Luna, who received his PhD at UNC Chapel Hill and is a professor of political science at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. He's the author of Segmented Representation, Political Party Strategies in an Equal Democracy, Oxford University Press 2014, and has co-authored Latin American Party System, Cambridge 2010, and he has co-edited The Resilience of the Latin American Right, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Thank you to all of you for coming, and to the rest of the panelists that came to the conversation. So if we start with Cesar, maybe. Now it's 10 minutes each, then I'll give 10 minutes of comments and we'll start the conversation.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation. I usually don't accept invitations to panels with no women, I assumed that there were, Vicky was inviting, and I assumed that wouldn't be an issue. So I also apologize for that. I also realized that this paper that I'm presenting was almost ready when for the original date of this conference, and this conference has been moved back more than a year, and it's still almost ready, right? So it's one of those things, one of those ironies. Also, let me start sharing the screen. I forgot about this part. And I've already realized that, is the screen shared already? Okay, good. I already realized that there's one typo in the first slide, because this is actually, even though I'm presenting, it's co-authored work with Osvaldo Amaral from Unicamp and David Samuels from University of Minnesota. So we're working on this together for a while, and neglected to add their names to the presentation, but they should be mentioned here too. So this paper in this conference, it fits, but it's not exactly on topic, right? So I'm not going to be talking about populism per se, and not even going to be talking about Bolsonarismo or Bolsonaro per se. I'm going to be talking about anti-partisanship, specifically antipatismo, which is linked to polarization, which is also linked to populism, but the main object is not trying to explain or trying to understand the rise of Bolsonaro in itself, but I think the issues are related, and one thing helps us think about the other. It's also kind of a strange paper for me to be writing because it doesn't have one specific test. It's kind of a narrative. I'm going to be making an argument. So hopefully you bear with me with here. It's not one of those crisp political science papers where we have a clear hypothesis we'll be testing. I'm going to be presenting some evidence and trying to tell a story here. Okay. So the main issue that we're talking about here is the partisanship and positive and negative partisanship. And in Brazil, positive partisanship means petismo, still means sympathy for the PT, which governed the country for 13, 14 years under Lula and Dilma. And also the rise of the black matter, it's nemesis, the rise of anti-partisanship, which is also basically antipatismo. So the interesting point here in this graph is the solid line, which is the share of people in Brazil or survey respondents that have answered that they like the PT or that they don't like the PT. And these are people who don't like any other party, right? So it's not like people who sympathize with some other party also don't like the PT. We're looking only at pure anti-partisans here. And what we see that over time, as the PT increased, so did the number and the prevalence of anti-partisanship, of antipatism. And to the point where even though Brazil is notoriously weak in terms of party identification, and the party system is very, doesn't have strong roots in society, we have almost half of people in respondents to surveys that place themselves either for or against the PT. Right? So this is the basic phenomenon we're talking about. Now, the interesting thing is that David Samuels and I wrote a book that was published, as Vicky mentioned, in 2018 with data. We stopped data analysis in 2016, but most surveys ended in 2014. So it was an early interpretation of antipatismo. And among the several things we saw at that point, we saw that antipatismo it was a large number of people. The second largest group, or the largest group in Brazil, is antipetistas. So we have petistas and then antipetistas. No other party comes close to that. They evolved in tandem over time, gradually. And we showed in that book that anti-partisanship, it looked a lot like an identity. It mattered a lot. People behaved in predictable ways. They used their PT or the anti-PT as heuristics to form to state their preferences. They engaged in motivated reasoning, just like positive partisanship. However, at that point in time, at least until 2014, petistas and antipetistas were not very different in many aspects. They came from the same social class, mostly at the beginning, but antipetistas had slightly less support for democracy than petistas, but there was no clear association with values, more conservative values. There was no clear association with religion. Possibly, there was a flaw. It was flawed in the surveys, but it was also not very salient, right? So we had this difference there. We were saying, look at this matters, but it wasn't something that people were talking about. It wasn't something that was really prevalent. And then since we finished the book, and we actually get cited for things we do not say in the book, right? We get cited for, antipatism, and what we're seeing today is not exactly what we had in the book. We had an increase in animosity. This is just a simple measure of Google Trends for the word antipetista or antipetismo. It essentially did not appear until the election in 2014. Then it kind of disappears and peaks again in 2018. So it wasn't something that existed in the public discourse before 2014. We saw that in the surveys, we were writing about it, but it was kind of latent. It wasn't out there. It became really, really visible over the last few years since 2014. And it led to a very extremely polarized presidential election in 2018. This figure, very briefly, breaks the population of Brazil in three groups: the antipetistas, the petistas, and the others that are none of that. We see that a huge majority of antipetistas voted for Bolsonaro. In the first round, a huge majority of petistas voted for Haddad, which is the Petit candidate. And this is even larger because there's still 10% there that didn't vote or didn't get to vote or that invalidated their vote. So of the valid votes, it's extremely polarized already in the first round. And we had like many candidates, but they kind of converged to both. And the second round even more. And since then, the debate petismo, antipetismo has more or less dominated politics. It's been around, it's everywhere you look. Bolsonaro came to embody petismo, antipetismo, but you're going to say that he didn't create it. Oftentimes Lula is associated with petismo, but petismo is also more than Lula. But Brazil's been this, as other places, have been this soul searching. Will we find another option beyond these two extremes, right? And it's kind of weird because they're not extremes in the same sense. They're extremes of electoral competition. They're not both ideological extremes, right? So the PT is way much less extreme than Bolsonaro is, but still the duality of the electoral competition leads to this kind of a polarization between the two camps. Okay, so how do we get here? This is more or less what the story we're going to try to tell. And it's not. And here I'm going to also deviate from other analysis and from things that I often do. We're going to look strictly at. It's not a causal argument. We're going to be looking at try to describe what was going on, and strictly political. Obviously, there are socioeconomic underlying processes. I think Juan Pablo talks a lot about these in his paper. Chico is going to talk a lot about the underlying economic determinants of this too. But we're going to be talking more on the level of purely politics, how these things get activated, right? So one thing to note is that partisanship. We talk about partisanship. It could be actually positive and negative, right? So most of the time, in most of the literature until recently, that about partisanship focused on positive partisanship, right? Back in the 60s, there was this distinction, but then it kind of disappeared because mostly in the US, if you're a Democrat, you don't like Republicans. If you're a Republican, you don't like Democrats. These things kind of complementary. So you don't really have, one doesn't really add much explanation to the other, except when you get like effective polarization, when people really start hating the other side, right? But in general terms, they kind of overlap. However, conceivably, you can be positive. You can have a positive or a negative. You can have or not have a positive identification with a party, like a positive partisanship, and you can also have or not have the negative dislike of some other party. And the interesting thing about Brazil, or what we found here in Brazil, is that because we usually looked only at positive partisanship, we were capturing those who liked some party, and then everybody else looked like they didn't like anything. But out of everybody else, there were a lot of people who did not have a positive identity, a positive partisan identity, did not like any party, but disliked the PT. And that group was very large. It was for 20 years already the second largest group, and today is actually a large group, right? So the most people, the biggest partisan group in Brazil is antipetistas, specifically pure antipetistas, people that don't like any other party and dislike the PT, right? And because we were not looking at that, we probably, if you don't look at that, you fail to understand that not all non-partisans are the same. Right? They're the non-partisans who are really not partisans, and then there are the non-partisans who dislike a party. So what we say basically, and I realize I'm going to rush here through the end, is that most of the time we get negative partisanship. The story is because some partisan is trying to highlight the differences, right, from against the opposition. So you say the other guy is bad because you want to promote yourself. In Brazil, that did not happen. It was a spontaneous evolution of anti-partisanship through more or less 2010, 2014. People disliked the PT. And then more recently, it was crafted, but not by other politicians. It was crafted by what we call non-partisan opinion leaders, which are, it's a bad term. We don't have a term yet, but it was not done inside the political system. It was done outside the political system. So here, I'm actually going to skip this figure here, but if you want to understand what it says, it basically shows the share of individuals in three different groups and four different groups. Petistas and antipetistas are the first two. So until more or less here in 2010, petistas and antipetistas are kind of similar from the same socioeconomic group. They're above average. And in 2014 onwards, they diverge. So the antipetistas become much richer and the petistas become poor in some sense, right? So you get a socioeconomic cleavage that didn't exist. That happens, and we believe that's part of a process, that the consequence of a couple of different processes. And when we say opinion leaders started crafting anti-partisanship, what we have is two sets of things that happened. One was the corruption investigations of Lava Jato. And I'm going to talk really, Vicky, 1 minute about each, and then I'm going to wrap up so I don't go over time because I realize I'm almost close to 10. And we also get a religious elite.
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. Activating some cleavages that were not existent before. Right. So the interesting thing about corruption is that this is just the same kind of graph. The first little point here is petistas. The second one is antipetistas, and the little dash line are non-partisans. Nobody said corruption was a problem until 2002. And then 2006 and 10, when Mensalão, which was the first scandal, happened, everybody thought corruption was a scandal, but it didn't polarize petistas and antipetistas. From 2014 on, corruption becomes a political issue. And that's part of the way in which Lava Jato was conducted, which is very different than the way Mensalão was conducted. Two big corruption scandals in Brazil. Both led to convictions in the PT, but the first didn't really polarize the electorate, and the second one did. So we might talk about what happened there, but it was really a strategy of the judicial branch of going after the PT in particular that led to this polarization. The other is organized religion. Until 2014, we don't see much differences between the petistas and antipetistas. The evangelical Christians were equally split, similar to the rest of the population. But after 2018, some point between 14 and 18, they become disproportionately antipetista. So it's not that they did not necessarily vote for the PT before, but they never identified as antipetistas. And something happens between 14 and 18 that kind of pushes the alignment of antipetistas, of evangelical Christians with antipetistas. I'm not going to tell this whole story because I'm way over time, but we can see that this is just very close to the election. Huge jump on evangelicals saying they are antipetistas. These are low-income individuals. The non-evangelicals, there's a slight increase in antipetism, which is a full line, but not such a large increase as among evangelicals. If we look over time, the same thing. And finally, then we get Bolsonaro, right? So I'm just going to throw it in. Bolsonaro did not create antipetismo. He embodied it, right? He came at the end. This figure shows the share of Bolsonaro. First line is the share of antipetistas that increased somewhat during the elections. And the second is the share of antipetistas voting for Bolsonaro, which becomes gigantic. So we basically get a convergence of different antipetista groups on Bolsonaro. It's not that Bolsonaro was heading something new. He was just embodying antipetism. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Sorry for going over time. Many questions that we can discuss later, and I'll leave it for later. Thank you. Sorry for going over time.
Thanks, Cesar. Francisco, you want to come next, please? And I'm going to also tell you at 1 minute.
Sure, thank you. Let me just share my screen. Where is it? Here. Okay. Let me have my time control. Well, thank you. Thank you, Vicky, for organizing this workshop and giving space for us. So I'm going to talk about how economic downturns may have affected this Pentecostal upsurge, but looking at a longer time horizon, and this joint work with Angelo Marco Antonio and Rudi Rocha. So the economic distress is usually associated with the rise of religiosity and religious fundamentalism in several contexts, right? And what we have seen is that as globalization unfolds and the discontents of the globalization stands out, the expectations that religiosity would fade away in increasingly modern society and connected societies have given way to this growing power of religions in the world's social and political landscape, right? And how the connection between economic condition and religiosity has been usually explained is by this theory of secularization that explains religiosity as an existential reflection of existential insecurity and a painkiller for suffering and frustration. Well, if this is the case, religiosity might be particularly responsive to crisis, right? To times of scarcity and risk, when the opportunity cost of time is lower. You need religions to cope with emotional suffering. And the value of social insurance, social network is higher, okay? So what we do in this paper, like we estimate the impact of economic distress on the expansion of Pentecostalism in Brazil. And the number of Pentecostal adherents has been growing not only in Brazil, but worldwide. And we look at Brazil because, as Freston says, like Brazil can be a trendsetter to this Pentecostalism phenomenon. So as we see here on the graph on the left, we see an increase in the share of Protestants and Pentecostals over time, and a decrease in the share of Catholics. And where we see an inflection point is exactly on the 90s. When you look at the graph on the right, that shows the growth rate by decade of Pentecostal, we see a spike in the 90s that was a decade of several economic crises, severe economic crisis in Brazil. And you see that in 2000, that was a boom decade in Brazil. The growth even lose a bit of force. So the first part of the paper, we try to understand what are the economic, how much economic condition affected this rise of religious affiliation towards Pentecostalism. So what we do, so we use census data and we exploit variation across local economic condition between 91 and 2000 to see how variation in economic condition is associated with the growth of Pentecostals. And what's this variation? It's local exposure to trade liberalization. So in the beginning of the 90s, Brazil went through a major trade liberalization. And there's several papers that they document that different regions in the country, they have been affected on different ways through this trade liberalization. And that regions greatly exposed to trade liberalization, to this globalization shock, they experience a worse labor market condition, higher crime rates, lower government revenues, less public goods provided by the government, so on. So what we find is that these regions greatly exposed to this trade liberalization, they experienced a faster growth of Pentecostal during the 90s. And where this growth is coming from mostly conversion from Catholicism, Christianity, to Pentecostalism. We find no effect on secularization or other religions, right? And more interesting, we find that this economic shock on the beginning of the 90s has persistent effect at least until 2010. That's the last data point that we have, okay? So after we see this effect on the increase in the share of Pentecostal, we try to understand if the expansion of Pentecostalism influenced politics, right? So conceptually, you can think like people can convert towards a new religion for spiritual or identity reasons, but they can also convert for non-spiritual reasons. They would like to have access to non-spiritual benefits that by joining a new religious group, you may have access, right? The social insurance component. And we conjecture that if you convert towards a religious group for a non-spiritual, non-identity mechanism, as you belong to this group over time, you start to acquire part of the values of this group. So dynamically, this could lead to shifts on individual values and political preference, right? So this, for example, this photo, this is not a church, this is not a chapel, this is a Brazilian Congress on a work auditorium during work hour on the afternoon praise. Some of these here are congressmen. So what we do first, like we look at whether the expansion of Pentecostalism influenced elections for the House Representatives, Deputados Federais, between 2002 and 2014. So we look at House Representative first because these are the body that legislate over constitutional issues like civil rights that they are important for the religious groups. And it's an open list proportional representation. So you don't need to gain the nomination within your party, right? So we code Pentecostal candidates by religious designation using their by name and by web scraping, and this work from Lacerda. And what we find is that, yes, regions greatly exposed to trade liberalization in the 90s, we observe more votes to Pentecostal candidates in the 2002 election, right? And actually, we find almost a one-to-one relationship between expansion of Pentecostal adherents and votes for Pentecostal candidates. And we see that this effect of this economic shock on the back then on vote share of Pentecostal basically increases over time, right? So it's as if like this political power of this Pentecostal of the evangelical caucus is growing over time, okay? So the last point that we do, and I'd like to thank Vicky for pushing us to do this last step, it's to which extent this rising political power of Pentecostals, they were pivotal in the last two presidential elections, when Dilma was elected in 2014 and when Bolsonaro was elected in 2018. Okay. So first, here we are going to look mostly at correlations. So this is just a plain correlation of Pentecostal growth between 91 and 2010 and vote share on the challenger candidate in both elections. So in 2014, this is the vote share on Aécio Neves, and 2018 in Jair Bolsonaro. So what we see is that even in 2014, regions that have a faster expansion of Pentecostal, they voted more for Aécio Neves. But we do see that Bolsonaro did get a stronger support in these areas of stronger Pentecostal growth in 2018. Okay, and part of the idea, I think it's what Cesar brought, it's that in 2014, the evangelical caucus was divided. You had some major designations like the Universal Church of Kingdom of God, they supporting Dilma and supporting the Workers' Party. In 2018, differently, no. The whole evangelical caucus was behind Bolsonaro. Okay, so, but these are only correlations. So what we try to do is like, we try to come up with a counterfactual to assess how influential this Pentecostal war. So first, we ask like, would Bolsonaro have been elected had the evangelical caucus, okay, voted as in the 2014 election? That is, if the evangelical caucus was divided as in 2014, would Bolsonaro have been elected? And according to our models, yes, right? Bolsonaro would still have been elected. And this is related to this, like there's many other factors behind this anti-establishment sentiment, right? So Bolsonaro didn't need this additional boost from the Pentecostal. I think Juan Pablo will mention something. I'll talk about this as well. But this doesn't mean that the evangelicals are not influential. So we see in our second counterfactual, what we ask is like, would Dilma have been elected in 2014 had the evangelical caucus voted as in 2018, if the whole caucus supported Aécio Neves? And the answer here is no. So the evangelical caucus were pivotal, or would have been pivotal to the 2014 election. Okay, so in sum, I think we document economic distress, increased conversion towards Pentecostalism, and this growth of Pentecostal is related to movements in politics. And I would like just to highlight this, that while it doesn't seem that the Pentecostal votes may have been pivotal for Bolsonaro, these votes are increasingly pivotal in Brazilian context. And this demographic is continuing to grow. The country continues in economic crisis. So it's likely to think that the political influence of this group will continue to grow. Okay, so that's it.
Thank you, Chico. This is great. So, Pato, do you want to go next, please? And I'll tell you at 1 minute as well.
Sure. Okay. I'm going to share my screen. And thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And so here's my presentation. The title is much more ambitious than what I do, but I did start trying to make sense of the multiple and contradictory explanations for the social uprising of October 2019 in Chile. Really, the main claim I will make in my presentation is that Chile was a success story in economic development and democratic consolidation since 1990. Everyone thought that Chile was sort of leading Latin America and becoming a European country. Everyone but Chilean intellectuals, because since the 1990s, there has been a strong and broad body of literature that points to the shortcomings of the Chilean development and democratic consolidation model. So scholars were predicting the end of Chile's model since the mid-1990s, and they were, or alleged not to be surprised when the estallido social took place in 2019. So I'm going to address a little bit that debate and then I will make the argument that the data doesn't really support the argument that Chile was on a decline in terms of democratic consolidation and satisfaction with democracy. And as in the end, I offer an alternative explanation. I will quickly go over some of the data. This is the VDEM Liberal Democracy Index, Chile, and the average for Latin America. Chile was slightly around average for Latin America before the 1970s, and after 1990, Chile has scored systematically above Latin American countries. This is GDP per capita since 1980. Chile is in sort of dark pink, and it shows that Chile was among the least developed countries in terms of per capita in 1980 in South America, and now it's, including Costa Rica, now it's among the most developed ones. This is extreme poverty in Chile. There is a whole debate on extreme poverty, but we used to measure it differently than we measure it now. In 2006, we changed the way to measure it. This is using the new indicator going back all the way to 1990. So significant reductions in poverty, significant reductions in income inequality as well. This is poverty with the new indicator since 2006. And the last measurement took place in 2017. This is income inequality in Latin America in 2016. And Chile is between the median and the mean for Latin America, so not among the most unequal countries, certainly not among the least unequal. Venezuela have the lowest level of inequality, so inequality is just one indicator of development, not the only one. This is reductions in inequality since 2000. Chile has shown more success in reducing inequality since 2000 than many other countries in Latin America. Yet another measure of estimation of Gini that also shows that the Gini coefficient actually increased in the first years after the restoration of democracy, and then it began to decrease again. But making the claim that Chile was or is the most unequal country in the world, or levels of inequality in Chile have increased over the past decade or the past 2 decades, are just not supported by the data. In fact, this is the percentage of foreigners who live in Chile since 1982 to 2017. The best indicator of whether a country is doing well is the number of foreigners that come to live in the country and the number of foreigners that leave the country, right? And Chile has seen a rapid increase in the percentage of foreigners living in the country. Yet, and this is perhaps significant, the perception of inequality in Chile has increased. So since 1990, Chile perceived, or Chileans perceive, that there is more inequality, where though inequality has actually declined, the indicators of, or the perception of inequality has worsened. But in general, Chileans perceive that the economic situation is not really bad. So this is the CEP series since 2007, on whether people think that the situation is neither good nor bad, that's the green, whether the situation is bad or really bad, that's the yellow, or good and really good. And as you can see, the country was mostly stable for the past 12 or 13 years, right? Chile is a very boring country in terms of the indicators, because nothing really happens in the country. And this is perhaps another interesting indicator on sociotropic perceptions, right? The situation of the country. And here we see a rapid increase in bad and really bad in the last poll in December 2019. But this is after the estallido social, after the riots. So it seems that when the riots took place, people said, yeah, this country really sucks, we don't really like it, so things are really bad. But it's after the riots, not before the riots. And this is a sort of a fascinating result. Now, we know that unequal societies are unstable societies, right? That's one of the first things we learn when we start studying political science. Unequal societies means that a lot of people are below the mean income, and that leads populist candidates to make promises and say, I will redistribute. They win a majority of the vote, and then they try to redistribute. They are overthrown, try to redistribute distribute and fail, or simply do not try to redistribute. But inequality is sort of breeding ground for instability. Now, the point that I want to make is that in the case of Chile, there has been a debate for 20 years about discontent with democracy. I'm citing this 1998 UNDP Human Development Report that mentions the alleged discontent with democracy. So if the world comes to an end, the evangelicals that were also saying, that were saying for many years that the world was going to come to an end might be right, but you need to explain why the world came to an end, when it came to an end, not just that after 22 years of preaching that the world was going to come to an end, that the discontent in Chile was going to exploit, it finally happened. So there is one problem with the explanation offered by intellectuals, and that is, okay, but why it happened when it happened? In fact, well, the paper has all the quotes about the discontent with democracy. And there is one point that I think most of the people who wrote about discontent with democracy get things wrong. And that is that they all claim that uncertainty of access is a bad thing. That when people started feeling uncertain, then they disliked what democracy had to offer. And here, I think what really matters is your relative position. Because if you are certain that you are never going to have a vaccine, then uncertainty is not really a problem for you, but you're never going to have the vaccine. You're only uncertain about the vaccine when you see the chance that you might get the vaccine. And I think that that's what began to happen in Chile since democracy was restored. People that were historically poor and excluded saw the perception. I mean, they saw sort of the gates of the promised land and they wanted in. And when they felt that they weren't able to get in, then they became frustrated. But it's not a problem of uncertainty. In fact, uncertainty is the refuge of hope, right? We all now are uncertain as to when we will get the vaccine, the COVID vaccine. But that's a better situation than when we knew there was no vaccine yet. So it's better to be uncertain about something that may happen than to be certain about things that will never happen. Now, and there is one more point that, in my view, explains the when, the why things happen when they happen. And that's the cyclical history of Latin America, right? So I always tell my students that when I took my first class—
1 minute, Pato.
Sure, I'm finishing now. So the cyclical nature of Latin America, and here are the prices of copper. All the crises, the political crises that Chile has experienced are associated with declining prices of copper. So if we want one explanation that accounts for all the crises that Chile has experienced, so when copper prices decline, Chile experiences political and social crisis. And this is the final point. I think that at this point, because of political developments that happens since 2014, the culprit for all the problems that Chile has had is the 1980 constitution. So Chileans found this magic pill, which is replace the 1980 constitution and then things will be fine in Chile. And I think that that's the combination that explains why the crisis happened when it happened, and perhaps most importantly, why the solution to the crisis was the process, the constitutional convention that we are beginning to have and will be completed by 2022. I will stop there because I ran out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pato. Let's continue with Juan Pablo now, please. 10 minutes, Juan Pablo. I'll tell you when you have one.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Vicky and everyone there. I also apologize for being part of the panel. I wish I could say this is work in progress, but it has been stuck for some time. If Cesar wasn't crisp, this is even significantly less crispy. So far, what I want to do is to present a series of ideas. Some are inspired by work I'm engaging with co-authors. The evidence—
You're muted, Juan Pablo. We cannot hear you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. Do you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah.
You didn't hear anything?
No, we hear until you are working with co-authors, and then we lost you.
So this is what I want to do in the presentation is to like flesh out the argument without the data that is in the paper. Essentially, what I want to make in these 10 minutes is two descriptive arguments, a causal hypothesis and an illustration. In terms of the first descriptive argument, I would say that what I try to argue is that we see in Latin America and in much of the world a collapse of legitimate political intermediation structures. That has to do, in the case of Latin America, with a series of long-term changes that I try to like illustrate in the paper. One is the destruction of political parties since transitions to democracy. Many of what was there at the time of transitions is now gone. You also see the emergence of tons of electoral vehicles, of which only a tiny fraction, updating Levitsky et al.'s calculations, we came to 4% of all those electoral vehicles that were created sticking around as relatively consolidated parties. And then two types of polarization that often alternate, system versus independence, right? Which does not necessarily lead to a new cleavage and structure. In the past, this type of cleavage created eventually a structure for the long term. The Peronist is the classic example. But if you see Brazil, Mexico today, you don't see eventually those type of cleavages sticking around. And you also see another type of polarization between an oligarchic coalition and a popular coalition. This is typical of more stable systems that have increased this type of polarization. And this is the way they get more stability. This is contemporary Argentina and La Grieta, right? But this type of polarization can rapidly go away, like in El Salvador with Bukele, right? You had this system structure around Arena and the FMLN, and then it came Bukele from a municipality and erased the structure that the system had. And at time of crisis, you see both types of polarization happening at the same time. In Chile today, all traditional politicians are polarizing in the left-right scale, trying to empathize with society, and society is polarizing in terms of insider-outsider, right? And you have this disconnect. What's the implication of this? And again, I'm trying to take a long-term perspective and a regional perspective on what has happened with the structures of representation. We seem obsessed with populism and polarization. We usually stretch both concepts. We do the same with the left and the right, and we spend lots of time analyzing the left turn and the right turn. At the same time, we long for institutionalized programmatic political parties. Yet what we have seen in the region for quite some time now is the chronic illegitimacy of political intermediation structures. And I would say all of them, not only institutionalized programmatic parties, but also the leaderships that come and go, usually in an anti-system or other type of the two coalitions I described before. So essentially, I think what we are witnessing is the emergence of a permanent cycling scenario in which you have electoral coalitions that can mobilize sizable segments of the electorate on election night, but come and go quite rapidly. And these coalitions are difficult to keep together. The second descriptive argument has to do with explaining this new cycling. I try to make the argument that this has to do with two mechanisms. You have more diversity to represent in society, and you have less available time to create a structure and govern in order to be able to legitimately represent that diversity. In terms of more diversity, social fragmentation along socioeconomic, territorial, age cleavages, the emergence and proliferation of single-issue, high-intensity citizens, identity politics, a series of anti-citizens, and here I borrow a lot from Cesar's and co-authors' work, also from Melendez's work on Peru. And these antis can mobilize around subjective and objective social mobility trajectories, around corruption scandals, around crime, around party brands, around malaise with incumbents, etc. So essentially what we see are successful candidates that mobilize different types of discontents and single issue demands, win the election, but then have a difficult time at structuring representation before the election, after the election and between elections, right? One example of that is the Buey Biblia Bala Bolsonaro type of coalition. This is just a recent example. The second mechanism has to do with time compression. You see, if you look at the party systems in the region and presidential leaderships, shorter honeymoons, rapid scandals, sudden popularity drops all over the place, right? And this has implications also for political entrepreneurs and their career decisions, right? Long political careers are usually chastened at the polls, except sometimes for restorative coalitions like Biden's, right? And with this, we welcome the US to Latin America, I guess. But this is not very usual, right? And this like compression of time also changes incentives for political entrepreneurs. Before, to be a candidate and eventually to get elected, you had to work and spend time in organizing, working for the party, getting the leadership to know you, right? And eventually you got elected, and you got elected with a structure that let you govern and be legitimate for a longer period of time. Today, you can get elected out of nowhere, but you have much less time legitimacy to govern once you are in office, right? So it's easy entry and easy exit instead of hard entry and more stable life in the system. I make the argument, and this is kind of what needs much more development in the paper. Everything needs development, but relatively to the other parts, that the collapse of representation and its two mechanisms have to do with deep structural changes in society and state structures that create what O'Donnell and Handlin in his recent book call a state crisis. This had to do with two dimensions of the state. One is the capacity to deliver public goods, to craft coalitions around public goods that are large enough to sustain electoral mobilization, etc. And also with the legitimacy crisis of fundamental state institutions, right? You see, if you go and you look at the local level and at the national level, you see corruption at the top and corruption scandals at the top, engaging politicians and business interests. If you go to the local level, you see corruption at the bottom between politicians, the police, organized crime, right? And this creates a deep legitimacy crisis for
1 minute,
state,
Juan Pablo.
not only for politicians. You get instances of institutional overflow, you have state police repression, then you have more institutional overflow, etc. I claim that there are some accelerators, I'm finishing, Vicky. I claim that there are some accelerators like institutional reforms and technological change, but I argue that what we should look at probably to understand the type of crisis we are in has to do with how the state and democratic actors interact in these societies. In terms of the Chilean case, and I finish with this, it's a model case turned into backward case, and what we are seeing today is similar to a crisis of representation in the Andean region in 1990s. And I think the implications for this is that what you have is an asynchronic cycling, right? Chile and Costa Rica, which were featured as model systems in the region, have gone through massive turmoil. Maybe Uruguay is heading that way too, right? There are some specific symptoms on that. So we have spent lots of time identifying paths and types of systems within Latin America. I think what we should be looking at is similar types of vicious circles across the board, in which cases like go around, and this is similar to what Pato ended up saying about cycles, instead of types of systems that are either consolidated, institutionalized, or in crisis. Across the cycle, we get analytically enthusiastic with some things, frustrated with others, while continue to look for parties that are not coming out anyway, or our way. Thanks.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Thanks to the four of you, I'm going to just make some comments to start the conversation, and then I will open to the rest of you. Please raise your hand with the function in Zoom so that I know whom to call. So these are excellent papers. I think they all talk about a crisis of representation and different aspects of polarization, not just the political one, but also a process of social polarization. Let me start with Francisco's paper. I think it's interesting that he provides a very clear causal change with empirical tests at all the stages of how the economic crisis, we already know from a large literature that economic globalization and trade shocks produce the backlash and increasing vote for Trump, for instance, compared to Romney. But what's interesting here is that we get at the psychological effect that brings religions in, and he didn't get into it, but he looks at suicide rates, which I found a fantastic indicator to look at as a way of measuring the anguish that moves people to join religion as an alternative here. Here, what's interesting is that he is really talking about the constituencies that Cesar's paper leaders, social leaders as he calls them, with his co-authors, are mobilizing, right? And so it's interesting that they have a constituency that's growing. It's not the same when you are the leader of a group that's static than when you are the leader of a group that's growing. And I think that's important for then what I will be asking to Cesar. But again, I think this is a paper that's very close to be sent off. And I really like that you join the exercise you did to join the pivotal weight of the evangelical voters. So I have a few questions and comments. One is on gender. It seems I found it interesting that you argued that the micro region females are more hurt by economic liberalization than males. Most of the literature I've seen on these type of papers in advanced countries suggests that males are more hardly hit. So this might be related to the type of economic activity, but I thought that in that regard, it goes in a different way to the rest of the literature. Also, the literature has looked at a lot at direct versus indirect economic effects in trying to explain the reactions to globalization and changes in policy preferences. And I mean, I know you have aggregate data at the census level, but I was wondering if by variation in economic activity or housing prices or some other measurement where there is variation, because in some cases you have some industries that are hurt by trade, but also other industries, and in others you would only have those industries. As well as gender and age that might have different effects, you could assess to what effect, if you have more of a direct or more of an indirect effect, it drives the religious conversion. And the other impact that I thought at the beginning you showed, this is mostly conversion from Catholicism to Pentecostalism. That's your graph. But what's interesting is that the Vatican, I mean, Brazil was also at the forefront until John Paul II of the liberation theology movement, which really makes a pitch to convert the poor within Catholicism. And that movement has really been, penalized by the Vatican since John Paul II. And in fact, Guadalupe Tunión, I believe, at Princeton has microdata because she has been looking on that for the PT. But to what extent, the Pentecostals were able to take advantage of this kind of supply-side shock that the liberation theology was not allowed to reach to the poor in the competition to the poor or the people who are suffering the more. And I think the data is there. I would suggest to contact Guadalupe, but I thought that would be an interesting way of giving a more nuanced picture as well. Cesar et al. Paper I've also, been reading since the book, and also other versions of this work. I really like the idea of the kind of the change in the corruption, the comparison between the Mensalao and the Lavallato, and I see this change, but it's not so clear to me what I mean. I know this is a descriptive paper, but coming from reading Francisco, what explains the shift in the Pentecostals? You were discussing it before. You associated to this education reform, and this happened in other countries of the region, in Peru, in Colombia. So it kind of makes sense. But is this a reaction to the policy, a backlash, or is in reality a political strategy of leaders that you call them social leaders, but in Francisco's papers, they're already a lot of them running for office, so they become political, that want to change. So there might have another reasons to shift, to break. You said before they were divided between the PT and anti-PT, and they break with the PT and they use this education reform to realign the followers, if you want. So what's the story of the leaders? That's my question. On the bottom-up process, on the shift in voters, here I was missing your work with Danny. I mean, I'm a big fan of your work with Danny, so that's not surprising. There was no economy, no pathos economic cycling, no economic vote. I mean, this happened when Brazil is undergoing a very deep recession. And so it seems to me that tolerance to corruption was much higher with Mensalao because the economy was doing well, whereas with Lavallato, the economy was doing bad. Even with Dilma mentions abortion, when the economy is doing well, people said, okay, maybe we can put up with it. But once the economy is doing bad, suddenly values become much more important. So what's the interaction between these two variables, and why is this absent given your other work? And finally, coming back to Juan Pablo's paper and the idea of a deeper crisis of representation that Bolsonaro embodied. So Bolsonaro does not just embody antipetismo, he embodies a crisis of representation that was absent from the paper. So in 2013, Brazil awake like Chile did in 2019, right? We woke up to protest against, corruption on construction, public services that didn't work. The young and the middle class were on the street. This was before the Lavallato. This was before the period you discussed. And yet it does seem to signal a crisis of representation that was deep and was already in place in a citizenry than voters that were not happy with their political party. So I wonder how these crises interact with the story of antipetismo. On Juan Pablo, I've seen other versions of this paper, and so I'm not going to go off the fact that the accelerators are two different. One technology I buy, the other is totally endogenous, like education. Institutional reforms is something politicians do to themselves. But I really like from the paper the idea of getting social polarization as a multidimensional. It covers many different aspects from not just economic divisions, but also security, subjective perceptions, how the elites ignore the larger population, and why sometimes this social polarization gets captured by political polarization and organized in this populist versus oligarchic, if you want to call it like that, and other times it doesn't, and so it allows the crisis of representation. Your table one, however, was a little bit tricky, and the way you ended might suggest, because the kind of the parties that were more stable in numbers were Paraguay and Uruguay, which more or less I would agree they are relatively stable compared to the region. But then the other two that follow were Chile and El Salvador, that seem already have gone to the crisis of representation. So maybe we're just waiting for Uruguay and Paraguay. It's a question of time, and that explains the low numbers. Here, however, I was trying to think of how can we measure social polarization before, we see the estallido, no, the upsurge. What are the measures that would allow us to predict, as you say, that Uruguay maybe is polarized and we're not seeing it? And how can we know, or when do parties organize and represent this social polarization in the kind of Argentina or Bolivia, as you call it, populist versus oligarchic? And when this social polarization has no agent to channel it, and it gets basically represented in all, que se vayan todos, right? The population is like in all political parties, like in Peru today or in Chile today, that is very fragmented. Nobody, the candidate with the most votes has less than 50% in the presidential race by now. So, and I do agree with the discussion you had about programmatic parties. And actually, my suggestion is to get over programmatic parties, right? Like I never love it, but I think that here the flow of your paper, one is expecting to read papers that represent social polarization, that are, maybe like the Peronists. Who knows their ideology, but we know if you're poor, you're more likely to vote for Peronists. So there is a clear linkage there. Whereas this programmatic classification, for me, it's entirely vague and much more subjective. So maybe we need to rethink those categories. And in terms of the shortening of time and the shorter honeymoons, I am a little skeptical here. It depends of what's your time period. But because I read Danny and Cesar, I agree with Pato. When the prices are high, people get reelected, and careers tend to be, relatively larger. I mean, I don't know what large it is, but people stay in office for a long period in the 2000s. So, we still have Morales going around. We still have Correa going around. In Argentina, all the politicians have been there forever. Macri was the newest we've got. So I'm not sure that I see it everywhere. So I would like to see under what conditions do you expect this shortening of times. And the other thing that I know you've been working on here, I'm going to push you on the empirics. You tell us that Latin American states are weaker. And there's a bunch of reasons. But are they weaker, or they've always been as weak and now we see it more? I mean, like is the reporting of crime that, it's not clear to me why would they be weaker, that they are not as weak as always, and we just have more information now. And let me turn to Pato's paper, which is more focused on the Chilean crisis and starts with a great summary of the intellectual discussions, although I have to say it arrived late. So, and I have to say that my reading of the Chilean crisis is not that only Chilean intellectuals were unhappy, right? If you look at survey data, people that believe that the conflict between the rich and the poor was important grew even before the crisis of 2019 in like 20 points in surveys. If you look at the CEP data on what were the most important problems for Chileans, pensions, education, health, and salaries, which were the issues that were on the street during the protests, were already there. And the type of people who went on the street, it's interesting, given all the work on religion. If you were not religious, you're much more likely to go on the streets. I mean, at least according to the CEP. If you are Catholic or Protestant or Pentecostal, you are less likely to protest. These were people that were more secular, that were more educated, but were also from the C and D classes, right? The lower middle class and the lower classes. So it does seems to me that there is an inequality issue that might not be captured just by income. It might include wealth. It might include the way Gini is measured according with Nora Lustig is not right because it doesn't measure the top of the distribution. but also the idea that Chile is the richest country in Latin America. In GDP per capita is supposed to be a rich country. So those levels of inequality should be compared with equally rich countries. And here, I like your idea of uncertainties. And the idea of the vaccine is, if nobody gets it, maybe I would put up with it. But if I know I'm not going to get it, but others will get it, then I'm not going to be happy, because the resources are there, but they're rationed for me and not for others. And this is, I guess, the sociology or the subjective beliefs of what happened in Chile that has relation with geography, inequality in geography, in treatment, and all of the things that have been studied, that I don't think can be captured exclusively by a genie. If we think of Chile, as you said, as a country that was on its way to Europe, as you started the presentation, the small open economies of Europe, they all have important safety nets and welfare states. And all of the political economy literature tell us that for them to work both politically and economically in terms of investment and lower labor conflict, they require that welfare state. So if they are right, you hope that the constitutional reform increasing social rights so that investment will come back to Chile, which is exactly the opposite way as you've finished the paper. So I would like to see how you match the predictions of the traditional political economy literature of small open economies. So again, these were 4 great papers, and I really will open, maybe I'll give a couple of minutes to each of the authors to respond, and then we'll open to others. I'm going to start the list here for questions. You want to go in the same way you presented? So, Cesar?
Thank you, Vicky. So I'm just going to touch very briefly the 3 main points you raised. So about the Pentecostals, right? So what we are looking at, and you might say, well, maybe we shouldn't be looking at what we're looking at, but we are looking at identification for and against the PT, not necessarily vote, right? So the story that Francisco told, I think it's completely compatible with the data that we looked at in other elections. And the story but the tricky thing is, we've seen movement in votes triggered by evangelical elites going one way or another, like moved in vote intention, but that doesn't explain why you build what we're calling antipactism as an identity, right? So the building as an identity is the potentially different phenomenon that we're getting this time. Votes definitely went one way or another before, I think, as the data that Francisco showed, and we wouldn't argue against that. We're trying to understand the identification. Why would someone actually answer a survey question saying, "Oh, hey, I don't like the PT," right? So this is the interesting question for us. Amy has a story, and she's here in the audience. That's a gradual shift that people became more conservative, and the pastors kind of follow because they're competing against other churches, which I think is very plausible. We seem to think, when we look at it, we don't have fine-grained data for the whole period, but there seems to be some more abrupt shifts, right? So the story that we find in the paper about the education reform is a story that, in our reading, and we don't have the full evidence for this, serves as a way to organize religious elites across the country. Coordination problem, solves the coordination, or helped solve the coordination problem for evangelical elites. And in a second movement, a second period, that coordination problem, once that coordination problem is solved, you're able to have a unified message and actually build an identity, right? And I think that's a little bit the story we're telling. As for economics, I totally agree with you. We're looking at the variation in the margin here. We're not looking at the huge processes, but I'll just posit that there's 2 interesting things about antipactism that kind of demand some more explanation than just the structural economical issue. I think first is antipactism in the latest data is a high-income white man thing and a poor evangelical women thing, right? So there's 2 different groups there. And these are probably 2 different logics. And it's interesting that even if you look at among the poor, the evangelicals today are much more likely to be antipatistas, even in the same income group, right? So you might say, okay, perhaps the ones that were needing more help self-selected into becoming evangelicals, which is Francisco's story, which might as well be true, but it didn't affect all poor people equally, right? Some poor people became more likely to identify as antipatistas than others. And presumably, most people are subject to the same type of crisis. So there's still some variation left within the broad picture of economics, and I totally agree. As for legitimacy, I'm going to leave it open. I don't have an answer. I really like Juan Pablo's term for a failure of political mediation, right? I think that's something that we have to think about. That is going on, but the interesting thing is that the whole process in Brazil is killing or killed the only party we had, right? So now we have not even that. So it's interesting. I don't know what to make of it, and I'm going to leave it open, and maybe we can think about it more. The only thing I would mention is that I have a reading of the Brazilian crisis of 2015, the riots, very similar to Patos, right? So a lot of that, of the dissatisfaction that actually emerged, at least in surveys, after that. It wasn't being registered before. So it's kind of weird, right? So it's I wouldn't totally agree with that. Dissatisfaction was brewing very heavily before 2013. We knew something was going to happen, perhaps, but we really learned about it after the fact. So I don't have a good answer for the last point, and I'll leave it at that.
Perfect. Francisco?
Hi. Thank you for the comments. So also just a couple of points regarding the gender. So actually, we don't find any differential effect of economic shock on conversion of women and men. Like, you are right that there is like gender difference on the effect of the how you're exposed to the economic shocks, to trade liberalization, and there is gender difference on the susceptibility to religious discourse. But all that we can estimate is the combined effect, the net effect of both, right? And this is one. And also, like, relate to the direct and indirect effect. I don't know if I understood it, but so far we cannot distinguish both, right? We are actually now even looking more closely at this, understanding the supply side expansion, the expansion of the supply side of Pentecostal churches, to try to help understand like what would be a direct conversion, indirect effect via this groups gaining power and being able to attract more people to their designation. But we don't have a good answer for that yet. And the liberation theology is a great point. That's kind of, we actually cite Guadalupe, and our method is kind of, as long as, then it's kind of economic, but as long as local index composition interacted with the industrial sector specific tariff change, if this is not correlated with the initial the initial presence of the theological the teoria da libertação, our empirical method should be capturing an effect that's not to this specific supply shock. But this is actually something that we could test with Guadalupe's data. That's a good suggestion. Because the idea of the empirical method is exactly to net these other supply shocks, right? But great points. And if I could, like, just also chip in on Cesar's comment, that I think it's very related to I think like this education shock is a great way, and I agree, I think, with Vic's point, that a great way for some religious designation, religious leaders, to escape some backlash from corruption scandals. So think some designation that they have been part of the Workers' Party government for more than 10 years, and now they face a backlash of corruption. So they have to jump out of the ship. They can't go and tell their people like, hey, they are corrupt, but wait a minute, you've been with them. So it's kind of, or they can say, look at these values. They don't hold our values. Let's hold our values, you see? So it may be a good kind of way to detach yourself from the establishment. But this is my
I have a quick question. We have a list of people, but just on this very point, maybe you can say something, maybe no. But somebody from the audience asked, how do you see the recent manifest by both evangelical and Catholic leaders for impeachment? I don't know if either Cesar or...
So these are all traditional Protestants.
Okay.
So these are not the Pentecostals.
Not Pentecostals. That's good.
Yeah.
Pato?
Okay, well, very quickly, thank you for your comment. I do agree with you that there was some discontent, right? But there's been discontent for the past 25 years. So the question is, why the discontent turned into what it turned and the consequences that it had. We had prior riots in Chile in 2006 and 2011, but they didn't lead to the rewriting of the constitution. So the consequences of these riots were much bigger than the consequences of previous riots. And while it is true that when you look at the people protesting, you see urban types, low middle class, it is also true that those were the groups that most benefited over the past 30 years, that they had access to education and healthcare. And that's why I think the argument sort of the vaccine metaphor is the most useful one, right? They're upset because other people are getting the vaccine first and they are not getting the vaccine. But this is, again, discontent at the gate of the promised land of the vaccine, right? There is a vaccine and we went in. It's not a discontent that Chile is on its way down. And I think there is a room for a large disappointment precisely because of the economic crisis Chile entered into, and precisely because of the high fiscal burden that the new constitution will entail. So Chile will go through the motions that Brazil and Colombia went through after they wrote their new constitutions. This is not going to be Venezuela or Bolivia, but it is going to be Brazil and Colombia. And the fiscal burden of the new constitution with lots of funded mandates will actually make it difficult. So the attempt to establish the social safety net that people want will actually make it difficult to produce economic growth in the future. And what we do know about Colombia and Brazil is that the safety net that the new constitutions put in place actually consolidated inequality, because not everyone gets a pension in Brazil. It's only sort of the middle and upper class that get good pensions, and the same with Colombia. So the irony of what's going on in Chile is that everything seems sort of going on the way of actually an increase in inequality, not a decrease in inequality in the long haul. But I will stop there.
Juan Pablo, and then we go to the list of questions.
Yeah, on the endogeneity of institutions, I cannot agree more, but there is a scope condition for that, that happens in cases in which you don't have the type of political turnover you see today in Latin America, right? The people who decentralized in Bolivia or in Peru, it's no longer there. And it's gone. So I think there is something to that, that it's not strictly endogenous. How can we measure social polarization before the estallido, for instance, in Chile? I think it's like for years we have been doing like fieldwork in like environmental sacrifice zones, in shanty towns. Katia Araujo has a whole line of research on authority relations in civil society that maps onto like seeds of polarization, but nothing escalated and nothing aggregated until the estallido happened, right? And when it happens, you have this, what Granovetters call cascades of collective action, right? And you have this kind of like dynamic set in motion in which you have aggregation and polarization at some point when you had the seed for that for many years and nothing happened at the national level, right? So I think it has to do with that, and it's very difficult to measure, and it's very difficult to like generate empirical evidence that it's credible to people like Pato, who looks at surveys, right, and aggregate results that in which you do not see these type of conflicts mapping at the aggregate level. So that's kind of the challenge, I guess, right? In terms of like programmatic classification, I agree with you. I mean, what you need is legitimacy and identity, right? And identification, right? But that comes from blood communities, for violence, from past conflicts, right? That's where it comes from, right? And you cannot have it both ways. That's kind of the tragedy we are in, right? The type of structure we used to have had to do with conflicts of the past that created blood communities, that created identity, populist mobilization in the past that created incorporation and de-incorporation, and that's a cleavage. You cannot have identity and identification when politics doesn't mean anything, like, or no matter who is elected, it means the same. That's the trap we are in. And I think we should acknowledge that because it's normatively very complicated to do so. Right?
Okay. Thank you very much. I
have more things on the stage, but we can get to them later.
Okay, I have a list of people. What I will do is I'll ask them to make their comment or question, and then we'll get back to the panelists so that we have time to get more feedback. I have Ken Roberts first.
Okay, well, thanks for a very interesting set of papers and a discussion. I just wanted to pick up on questions around the crisis of representation in the Chilean case, which I think is puzzling for the reasons that you all have mentioned. And Juan Pablo, in one of your latter slides, you compared the crisis of representation in Chile to the Andean region in the 90s. But what's striking is that in the 90s, in the Andean region, if you go to Mainwaring's book and other work, there's all this talk about the crisis of the state, and that the crisis of representation in the party system was connected to a broader crisis of the state and the economy, and the difficulty of political parties to operate and to build strong societal linkages in that context. I think the Chilean case is quite different. I mean, certainly there's a crisis of representation. I don't think I've ever seen a brecha, tan grande is what you see in Chile between society and the political institutions or representative institutions. It's quite dramatic. But I would, and so how do we explain where you don't have the kind of economic meltdown that you had in Argentina in 2001, or the crisis of the state that you had in the 1990s in the Andean region? And so I've been grappling with this puzzle that Patricia was talking about as well in the Chilean case. But I wondered, does Chile show us perhaps the limits of the democratic, how should I put, sort of the democratic legitimation of the neoliberal model? Given that Chile, I think most of us would probably agree, Chile was the showcase of neoliberalism, not only the most successful case in its own narrow economic terms, but it was the case that had the strongest political institutions to reproduce it over time. And yet somehow we end up with October 2019 in Chile. And as Vicky was saying, in the small open economies in Europe, where you have liberal economies, but they're surrounded by the social protections or the welfare state. It's interesting to me that all the contestation of the neoliberal model you see in Chile, it's not really around what I would consider to be the macroeconomic core of the model. It's around what I would call the social pillars of the model, right? So it's education, it's healthcare, it's pensions, to a limited extent, the labor markets. And so I guess the question I have is, is it conceivable to maintain sort of the open macroeconomic core of the neoliberal model while working to have more inclusion around those social pillars in ways that could try to address the crisis of representation?
Giancarlo?
So, I mean, thanks to ILAS for organizing this. And I have a question/comment for Pato. So there are, I think, a couple of relevant things that were overlooked in your paper. The first one, I will say, is the international context. So social protest and unrest was not unique to Chile in 2019. And I'm not saying that there was some sort of snowball effect from Ecuador, for example, but I think it will be informative to put the Chilean case in comparative perspective to have a better understanding of this social process. My second point is about the representation, the crisis of representation. You mentioned this, but you never really engaged with this argument to trying to understand what happened in Chile. And actually, it's very hard to imagine the same outcome, the same level of unrest with parties that were actually able to connect with people, that were able to channel, the discontent and frustration with the political system. So I think this is something crucial that you're missing in your argument. And the third one is, I mean, this discussion about uncertainty and certainty, I mean, is provocative, but at the same time kind of confusing. I mean, uncertainty in a way is the lack of answer to some sort of key questions. So what happened if I get sick? What happened if I lose my job? What happened when I retire? And since some sort of like, this is, I think that the answer to those questions is connected with what Vicky was mentioning about the lack of, not necessarily a welfare state, so some sort of basic safety net. So, and also you never really engage with that point. Yeah, those are my 3 comments, questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Amy?
Sorry. Hi. What great papers, and I have too many things to say them in 1 minute. First, so that I'm going to send you, whenever I find time to type up all my comments, I'm going to send you something that looks more like a real review, because I just have too much to say. Very quickly, well, so first of all, I'm going to be presenting a paper in 2 weeks that effectively responds to your paper, your response to your paper in advance. So I think almost we could have our conversation about what's going on there after we after you read my paper, and I will email it to you in advance too. But Smith and Boas are arguing that that it was precisely the rise of gender ideology on the agenda, or what could be reframed as gender ideology on the agenda, that stimulated this, or we argue in a broad Latin American context, that these kinds of debates, that these issues are ones that are triggering of an evangelical realignment. So basically, I mean, effectively, our papers are arguing similar things. I would also say I have recently discovered the work of this really great historian named Benjamin Cowan at UCSD, who I think is a must read for all of us. And so I'm just going to put a plug in for him out there, and then I will send you all of my other comments, which are multitudinous. Francisco Costa, I sent you comments on your paper like about a year ago, or just an email with just some, I cold emailed you out of the blue when I was at the Wilson Center after I first read your paper. I think this is a really cool project. I think it's really promising. The one thing I would say right now, and I can send you a few more comments, but Taylor Boas is working on similar issues and has similar findings as yours, and I would suggest looking up his work and maybe citing it too. Last, for Patricio and Juan Pablo, who I'm going to talk about together, even though I guess because they are doing similar things. Even though I have very different questions for the two of you, even though I think of your papers as being together. Pato, I would suggest bringing in a social movement literature, a social movement framework to try to explain this. I think you're implicitly running through sort of the kind of reasoning that people go through in the social movement literature to try to explain this. And I think that it might help you to bring in that theoretical framework to structure the argument. For one thing, I mean, you can think of, the basic explanations are about grievances versus relative deprivation, and you run through this grievance versus relative deprivation without talking about them in those terms. But I think grievance versus relative deprivation would be important. And then, but it seems that neither grievance nor relative deprivation are sufficient explanations, which is generally the point that the social movement literature typically arrives at, is that neither one of those can explain the phenomenon X in question, or phenomenon Y in question, I guess. So then the answers typically go beyond to look at framing processes, to look at political opportunities. And so I think that you want to look at what the political opportunity structure, I think in particular in this case, looking at the political opportunity structure might be useful for helping to explain this phenomenon. So yeah, just generally sort of frame the article around that social movement. I think it will provide a really easy kind of way to structure the essay. Juan Pablo, I really like this a lot. I like the idea, I like the ambition in it. And I just have so many questions after it. It leaves me with so many questions cycling that I hardly know where to start. Just one question. I think the media is underlying a lot of what you're discussing, and the media isn't discussed in the essay. So I wonder if the media is affecting the way people can frame their grievances, the way people understand political time. And when I say media, sorry, I mean both social media and traditional media. So I think social media, some combination of social media and traditional media are framing, are affecting the way people are understanding legitimacy. I think that it's affecting the way people understand time. I think it's affecting the way people understand service delivery. And I think it may help sort of provide a thread running through that isn't there right now. Okay, thank you.
Alejandro Velasco.
Thanks, Vicky, and thank all of you for your papers and presentations. Some of the comments that I want to make and questions are
Can you put the volume up, Alejandro?
You know what? I think I'm just going to take off my
phone because it's terrible. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so thank you everyone for your papers. Some of the questions that I have already been alluded to, so I just want to amplify them a little bit in case it's helpful. But most of them have to do with Patricio and Juan Pablo's ones. But in particular, for Cesar, one of the things that and I think Vicky was alluding to this with the comments about, que se vayan todos, etc. In the case of Venezuela, which is the one that I study, the phenomenon is more, we call it sort of the ninis, ni chavistas, ni oposición. And so periodically there's been moments where the ninis, if you sort of track them in terms of polling data, they seem to be even higher than the affiliation with Chavismo or opposition, whatever that opposition might be at any given time. And yet when it comes time to vote, those distinctions seem to evaporate. And then people, even if there's an attempt to try to capture that Nini vote along a particular sort of party position or an alternative position, they never go anywhere. And so I guess my question for you is, there seems to be something, it's not just a negative kind of, or I guess a way to put the question is, in what ways, right, do electoral contests and contexts tend to, by their very nature, polarize even people who may not want to exist in a polarized framework, right? And in a context of compulsory voting, that might be one way to think about it. But so how, in your reading of it, do we come to understand the polarizing nature of elections, or the repolarizing nature of elections, in contexts where, as you've described, people may not be associating with a polarized, or in fact may be rejecting of that kind of polarization? So that's a question I had for you. And for Pato and Juan Pablo, I mean, to me, it was really interesting that both of you seem to arrive at a similar place, but coming from different priors. And so where I think both of you arrive is in the idea that the constitutional referendum actually, to some extent, is a real problem for Chile. And that it opens up a lot more that is potentially negative than positive, whether it be expectations, whether it be concrete policy proposals, et cetera, et cetera. But where Juan Pablo, I think, is leading to a discussion that, in fact, to some extent is the opposite of Pato's, which is that actually these are long-stemming problems that we're building up, and we sort of see the outcome in the protests and in the referendum. For Pato, the explanation is counterfactual, because it's like, actually the real way to understand this is that what happened last October in Chile is an explanation of the success of democracy, not of its failures, or of successive liberal democracy and of the Chilean model, not of its failures. And I think the problem with that argument is twofold. One, that there's a certain kind of tautology to it. And I remember hearing this argument a lot about Venezuela in the 1990s, where the problem with Venezuela and the rise of Chavismo was that the reforms were too successful, and people just didn't kind of get them. And if they'd only let them mature over time, that these things would have sort of worked themselves out. But there's a little bit of a cop-out to that argument, and in particular, I'm thinking about the work here of Janina Welp, who in a recent response to Levitsky's and Ziblatt's work, she says that there's a kind of overemphasis in institutional sort of weakening, but in fact, really what seems to be at stake is the inability of institutional actors and those who study them to take seriously as Amy was mentioning, the not perceived but actual social grievances that, yes, are made possible by a strengthening of a democratic system, but are nevertheless real. So I guess I would just want to see both of you kind of talk to each other really about how it is that you arrive at a similar conclusion, but actually coming from very different places. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alejandro. I have Eduardo now.
Thanks everyone for a wonderful set of papers. I have a question for Cesar. Really found this paper super interesting, and I know you said at as prefaced your presentation by saying you weren't going to make a sort of causal argument here. But I guess I wanted to push you a little bit because parts of your argument sort of point to at least mechanisms, and so I'm curious if you could talk in particular about nonpartisan opinion leaders. I think that's the phrase you use, right? So the article kind of points to judges and prosecutors on the one hand, and then religious leaders on the other hand. I want to focus on the first, right? So to what degree can we be confident that these are actually nonpartisan actors? Because if we kind of reflect on the literature on the politicization of the judiciary in Latin America, or the judicialization of politics, right, then the court and court actors are inherently political. And second, a key factor here that appears at points, as this kind of echoes something that Amy was mentioning before on a different paper, is the media, particularly for judges and prosecutors, right? They're turning to the media as a tool to punish particular politicians and parties. But again, here I kept wondering, and I don't know about the media landscape in Brazil, but I'm wondering, the politics of the media in Brazil as it relates to corruption scandals, right? Who owns the media conglomerates? Are they linked to political parties and elites? And if so, which ones, and what might that imply for your argument? And then a very quick question for Patricio. I also found this super interesting. I guess my overarching comment kind of echoes what Amy and Vicky were also mentioning as well about, I guess I wanted to hear more about unpacking the protests themselves, not only in terms of actors, but thinking about it over time, right? This wasn't a one single event, but it evolved over time. And so I'm curious as to if we could sort of think about what were the factors that sort of led to phases of the protest over time? And if that might help to sort of flesh out a bit more, what were the factors that were catalyzing this massive political movement or mobilization? And in particular, the state seemed to be quite absent in the protests themselves, right? So the state sort of disappears in the analysis, but I was curious, how does the state respond, right? So mainly, I would say mainly through a massive show of coercive force and human rights abuses, right? In the declaration by Piñera of the country being at war. So how does that sort of kind of relationship between the protests and the protesters and the state maybe serve to further catalyze protest and mobilization in ways that might not be captured in the framework that you're using? But again, thanks to everyone for wonderful presentations and papers.
Thank you, Ernesto.
Thank you, and well, thanks for the invitation and thanks for the wonderful papers. And I think I have one question that goes in line with what Patricio had been presenting. I think that we've all been baffled for several years by the fact that most of the things that we find in surveys do not align with most of the explanations. So when they're bringing the issue of inequality, if we go to any of the surveys that we have, the people that have the highest perceptions of inequality are not the ones that are mobilizing the most, are not the ones that are protesting the most. There's very little alignment between disclosures of grievances by people and actual mobilization. So it remains baffling because the arguments about inequality, the arguments about grievances do not quite fit what we have in the surveys. So I wanted to get a bit of a sense of that, because I have the same impression. We measure antipartism following also Chico in Brazil. We've been doing the same kind of things. We're not finding strong relationships. So I would love to hear, where do you think the grievances and the intensity is coming? I've been, while we were talking, I was bringing some of the figures that we have from the survey. We've been cutting the data up and down: income, gender, location. We analyze assimilation and contrast, polarization. There's no difference. The people that are the most polarized tend to be the ones that are the insiders, not the outsiders, tend to be the older, tend to be the wealthier, tend to be the ones that are more engaged in politics. So I perceive a bit of a dissonance between the papers that are trying to establish that there's a failure of representation and the fact that the data is showing absolutely nothing. And it's becoming a real problem, I think, in trying to figure out what is going on in Latin America.
Thank you, Ernesto. And I don't know if we do have the comparative data, but I think the protest of 2013 in Brazil, might be the future, that maybe Brazil, following Juan Pablo, is ahead of the game for Chile, right? Because in demographics, they look similar in many aspects, in the type of groups that went to the streets. Not sure about public opinion. So why don't we have 15 minutes and a lot of issues, so why don't we give it back to the paper panelists? You want to go in the same order, or do you want to reverse order? Why don't we reverse order? Juan Pablo, you start.
Okay, I'll try to cover as much as I can. You had a question about the weakness of the state, and Ken came back to this in the comparison with the Andean crisis. I think if you think about state crisis in terms of economic crisis, there's a difference there, and that Pato shows that, right? But I think what I'm trying to think through here is a relatively less capacity of the political center to structure local reality, right? And in that sense, I think states can be administratively more efficient, even coercively more efficient, but they have a difficult time at structuring and homogeneously structuring local reality even in places like in Chile, right? So what you see when you go to marginalized sectors, right? And I will have something to say about this in relation to Ernesto's comments. You see a lot of grievance in terms of lack and inequality in terms of social and civil citizenship and access to local and civil citizenship that does not really scale up, does not really go beyond the local communities that you are looking at, but that is there, and that fuels like discontent with the state, with politicians, with the system, right? That's and this is what has to do with Ernesto's point, and I think you're truly right. I mean, these communities do not mobilize, right? They barely go to the votes, to the polls, right? In many cases in Chile, they don't vote, right? You have many municipalities here with turnout being really low and still keeping being low after the estallido, though it has grown. So that's what's there in the ground. But that has to do with visions of the state that both portray political elites, business elites, social elites as colluded against the people, right? And at the same time, the police, judges, attorneys, mayors also in great dealings with narco trafficking, with organized crime, etc. And in that sense is what I'm trying to say, that the states are weaker. And if you go back in time, the national political parties were instrumental in making the state arrive at different localities and make it be there and be present and structure local localities and local power in more efficient ways than what you see now, where you have lots of independent candidates in every district. They don't aggregate with parties. They don't coordinate with other politicians besides that locality, but they control the locality and make that locality look in certain particular ways that eventually fuel discontent. In terms of Alejandro's question, you are exactly right. I think what we differ on with Patricio is on the implications. I think that the process is structurally overdetermined, and therefore there is not much to do in shaping agency in the short run, right? Whereas Pato is trying to convince people that this is going to help. And I agree with that, but I don't think we can convince anyone to change path. In terms of Amy's point, yeah, social media, it's key. If you look at the Stasio, we have a paper looking at new media and Facebook and shares and likes of new media. And what you see in a very short time span, all mainstream media getting chastened in terms of likes and shares, and people moving to alternative media, very political media, mobilizing people and fueling protests. Right, so there is something to do with that. Ernesto has a lot of work on that too. And I think this is the last thing that perhaps answers some of the other questions on Chile. Is I think what many people expect we have in Chile is a constituent assembly. What I think we had is a destituent movement, and that does not get you a constituent assembly. And that's the challenge you need to solve.
Okay, let me go next. Thank you for all your comments. They're very insightful. I do have an issue with the notion of the crisis of representation. And this is because the paper was written, we've been talking about a crisis of representation since the mid-1990s. I think the paper was published in 1997. If for 23 years Latin American countries have experienced a crisis of representation, maybe it's about time to accept that that's how democracy works, and that the ideas we had about how democracy was going to work were simply misplaced. I mean, this is how democracy works in Latin America and everywhere else as well. So I don't like talking about a crisis of representation, especially when we have been talking about a crisis of representation for 23 years. And it reminds me of the old debate in Chile about when the transition to democracy would end. And it's been 30 years since the dictatorship ended. The transition to democracy ended at some point, but we're still not in a transition to democracy. Perhaps we should just breathe again, Robert Dahl, and sort of accept that we live in polyarchies that are imperfect democracies. So I value those comments about the crisis of representation, but I think we need to stop using that concept to describe how the democracies in Latin America have been working for the past 25 years. I think the other comments are great. I will seriously think about them. The issue of uncertainty, the point I wanted to make, Giancarlo, was, okay, so before, most Chileans didn't have access to healthcare or pensions. So before the private pension system, the state pension system covered about 25% of the elderly, the old population. So there was no uncertainty. People knew that they were not going to get any kind of pensions. But now that people do get pensions, and I think the argument there that Vicky made makes a lot of sense. When people know that others are getting things, they also want to get those things, especially when the country has reached those high levels of development. The big question is whether the country can create the social safety network it needs to create without losing the rapid economic growth that the country had so far experienced. And I think that's a challenge that no Latin American country has successfully made, right? Building a social safety net and at the same time continue growing at a rapid pace. I'm also baffled by the discrepancies between what the polls tell us and what the general explanations are. But the polls are not that wrong. I mean, when we think about what happened in Chile with the Constitutional Assembly referendum that took place in October, participation rate was 53%, 52% of those eligible to vote. So automatic registration, everyone is registered, only 52% of those registered voted. Of course, it was in the middle of a pandemic. The participation rates among the elderly declined, but everyone was celebrating the high participation rates among the young population, but they were still in the high 50s. So 1 in 2 or 4 in 10 Chileans, younger Chileans, didn't turn out to vote. So there is an element of a lack of involvement. So this is important for everyone, but the participation rates were much higher among the upper class and the more educated as well. So there are some elements there, and I especially want to thank Amy, and I finished this on the issue of grievance and relative deprivation, because I think those are very important comments. So I will look into that literature.
Okay, Francisco, and then Cesar. We have 7 minutes, so you need to be fast. About 3 minutes each. A little bit more.
So I'll be really fast. Like just like thank Amy for the comments, and please send more comments. Good to meet you, but then I would like just to resound Patricia's point on this crisis of representation, at least regarding this Pentecostal vote. If the segment is growing in society, it's expected, and it's democratically expected, that the representation of this group grows in the government, and they gain more political power to pass their worldviews. So in some sense, I would like just to clarify that I don't think that our paper per se mentions anything regarding a crisis on representation. On the other way, on the opposite, like it's as the base of the population changed, the political representation is changing. That's a good point. I'll let Cesar speak because he has more points to tackle.
Okay, I'll take that as a compliment, Francisco. Okay, real quickly. One point regarding Alejandro's and one Eduardo's, and then maybe if you have time, I'll get to Ernesto's. But Alejandro, I think it's an interesting point that electoral polarization. So we can get electoral polarization, right, and not necessarily underlying polarization. I think that's a little bit what we are trying to get at, because by looking at, so in the previous work, in the work that I did not present here, we kind of tried to establish that the antipatism, even before it became really acute, was already kind of an identity, right? So it's in the same way that you have a partisan identity, you can have an anti-partisan identity. So we're trying to say that it was a little bit more than just like a stated preference. We try to show that it was something meaningful. What is worrying, I think, for me, is that the polarization has become polarization between these identities, right? So it's not just voting behavior that, oh, you vote for one or another, you get a polarized election and whatnot. You actually get a meaningful identity. Some people meaningfully describe themselves as petistas, some people meaningfully as antipetistas. And you see all the process that happens with Republicans and Democrats and other Brexiteers and non-Brexiteers, where you get sorting into these two worlds, but you also get the radicalization of the two, right? So you could have sorting without radicalization, you could have radicalization without sorting, but you get to a point where the main political identities in the country have become extremely polarized, and you've got the religious issues sorted on top of that. So it's become even more identitarian, right? To the point that it's polarized. When you get polarized around identities, I think that's when we kind of start worrying. And it's happening other places. The different thing, what I think is slightly different about Brazil is that we have this, the people on one side also have a positive one, and the people on the other side don't, right? So these people appeared here and they were ripe for anything, and they happened to be Bolsonaro, which was a bad luck. Now, Eduardo's, just a point on the non-partisan opinion leaders. I meant to say non-partisan, not non-political, and I might have slipped the tongue here when presenting. In the paper, it's non-partisan, right? Of course, they're political. I think they were non-partisan in the sense that they were not promoting another party. They were against the PT in both the Lava Jato, right, part. which is the other part of the paper. And definitely the media was together. But the thing is, I didn't want to put the media there as like, the mischief media, which is extremely right-wing and concentrated in Brazil. But there was a really strong interplay between media and Lava Jato. But that was part of the Lava Jato story, right? The Lava Jato story, it looks exactly, if you look at the descriptions of in Italy, there was a strategy to bypass the judiciary and to go to the public to win a public conviction. And they feared that they wouldn't get an impasse. They didn't just want to get convictions; they wanted to go for the jugular, right? So it was a deliberate strategy. It was picked up by the media, and I'm not going to cite the paper here because it would be nepotism. But we have a reference in the paper for a paper that actually looked at the media coverage and how it was biased one way or another. So that's actually part of the story. We didn't want to put the media as the main player because the media has business incentives to pick up on the juicy stories, right? So it could possibly not be necessarily intentional, even though it probably was. But on the part of the Moro and the others, it was clearly intentional, right? And they actually ended up fostering anti-partisanship. And I won't answer Ernesto because Vicky is already stretching over there.
No, you have 1 minute. So
1 minute.
Just to
run
that.
One interesting thing, I won't answer, but I'll just kind of raise the issue here with Ernesto. It seems that it wasn't the poorest of the poor that went to Bolsonaro, because they were actually in some ways protected by the states, right? So the poorest and the poor in the Northeast, they didn't feel as much the economic crisis. They didn't have as many grievances because they had some network protection, safety net. The poor that are subject to the markets, which are usually the urban poor, they are the one that swung more towards Bolsonaro. So it's kind of interesting, right? Because in some ways, the state had enough capacity to actually keep some people from swinging that direction. Even though they were poor, they were kind of protected. The lack of protection actually led some people to support Bolsonaro. Interestingly, Bolsonaro is elected with a less Brasilia, less state argument, which is really bizarre, right? People are voting against themselves probably, but who knows, right? But that's really part of the story. But just to say that maybe that actually helps us think a little bit about legitimacy, right? Some people were protected. They did not turn so much against the PT because they actually were protected, right? So it makes sense to think about where the state gets there, where you provide some services, people actually like it more. But anyway, it's not an answer, it's a comment.
Thank you, Cesar. That brings back the issue of the safety net and risk and how it plays, I guess, in political preferences, not just in Chile, but also in Brazil. This was a fantastic discussion. I want to thank you all, the panelists and the participants and those who were watching by Facebook, and invite everyone to the next session, which is next Friday at 1. And it's called The People from a Socio-Cultural Perspective with Federico Finkelstein, Claudio Lomnis, Graciela Montaldo, Galia Solomonov, and Amy Chaskel. I hope to see you there. Thanks to all of you for fantastic papers and great comments.